which is a quote by Danny Silk, and the quote says that we develop a culture of honour by drawing the very best out of people through words of praise and correction. And I love the fact that there's those two parts at the end of that it's not just words of praise. It's really easy to draw out words of praise. Well, you might say it's not really easy. Some people could stand there and say it's really difficult to praise someone. Sometimes it's really, really hard to praise someone when you look at them and everything in you just wants to slap them because they're being stupid or doing something daft. And it's like you sit there and you think, this would be a really good time just to correct them with the right hand of fellowship around the side of their face. But sometimes we have to bring words of praises, but there are a time for words of correction as well. And this morning I want to look a little bit at some of those times where we see in the Bible what Jesus does in the same situation, and particularly the relationship between Jesus and Peter as well. There's some really interesting things that I find in this relationship. But firstly, I want to talk a little bit about a relationship that I have, and it's with a person who's actually in this room, and I wasn't convinced that he was coming until yesterday, and so it's really interesting. We'll see how it goes, sort of talking about him while he's in the room. But that's my dad, who is sat there. If anyone doesn't know my dad, he's sat on that table in the white jumper. Yeah, Tony, if you can just sit there and cover his ears for about half an hour, that would be lovely. But most of you probably know, some of you might not, but for about the age of 10, I started working with my dad in school holidays. It wasn't slave labour or child labour or anything like that. He offered, and I loved it. I couldn't wait. School holidays would come round, and I couldn't wait. I remember one morning I got up, and it was early. It was about 7, that's early for me, 7 o'clock in the morning. And I got up and went downstairs, and Dad had already gone out the house. And I thought, he's left me, he's forgot that I'm coming to work with him. And this was before I had a mobile phone or anything like that. I was about 12 years old. I had no way of getting in touch with him, so I sat on the sofa just waiting, like a little puppy who'd been left at home, just sort of sitting there hoping he would come back. And he did come back about 7:30, and he said, oh, me and Mom decided that it would be better if you stayed at home today. There's some things you need to do at home rather than coming to work with me. I was so gutted. I was left. It was like an abandoned puppy who'd been left at home. And I loved going out to work with my dad through the holidays and spending time with him, learning new skills. I remember the very first job I ever worked with him. We were building a deck. It was chucking it down with rain. It was in Lichfield. I can remember the street it was on and everything. But it was absolutely chucking it down with rain. The weather was awful, and I loved it. It was great. I got to pick up a saw and chop things and stuff. It was just great. It was my dream. And as you can see, I've kind of carried that on because I find something in the church to chop up now and take a saw to whatever I can. But I absolutely loved being able to go to work with Dad. And then I stopped at about 16 when I started going into college and things like that. And my ideal job at 16 was either to be a banker or an accountant. That was what I thought I wanted to do with the rest of my life, was to be a banker or an accountant. I thought that was where I wanted to go. I realised by the time I finished college that was not where I wanted to go at all. I'd spent 2 years in college doing A-levels in business studies and in mathematics and all this kind of stuff. Passed those but hated it, and thought, you know what, I want something that I can just do practical again. I want a job outside where I can just get on with stuff. And really didn't know what I wanted to do. I had no idea. And started working with my granddad. Came and offered me a job fitting television aerials. So I did that for 2 years. And at the start, I really, really loved it. It was great. Apart from the fact that it was up on roofs. I didn't like heights at the time. So I thought, this really probably isn't the job for me. But I thought, well, I'll go along with it anyway. And I was really thankful that the very first job I ever did with my granddad was on a bungalow with a flat roof next to it. So I thought, even if I fall off the roof, I've got a flat roof to catch me, so I'm sorted. So I started this job on this, putting up television areas with my granddad. And I remember through that first day kind of building up that I would start on this bungalow, and then at one point I would go up the ladder and just pass him stuff. And at the very last job we did on the day, I got up the ladder and got up onto the roof and sat on the ridge tiles while he did the work, because I was too scared to move. So I just sat on the ridge tiles for about 15 minutes while he was on the roof. But after about a week or two, you kind of get used to it. You start getting, and now it doesn't bother me going up on the roof. I hardly ever use a roof ladder. Some of you might have seen me the other week when we had wind and it blew the corner of the soffit stuff off the church, and it was like, oh, I can get up if I jump on the roof, and ran up with a screwdriver and screwed it back on and sort of hanging over the edge. It just doesn't bother me anymore. But then that job kind of finished, and we kind of just ran out of work. And I was left sort of thinking, well, what on earth am I going to do now? I still had no idea what I really wanted to do. I had no sort of idea of what was in my heart of this is my dream job. It certainly wasn't banking or accountancy again. And so what my dad said was, well, you can come back and work for me whilst you look for something else to do. And I remember working with him and thinking, well, yeah, that's great. I've got something that I can do. It's better than sitting at home. If I sat at home, my mum would make me do the cleaning. So I thought it's got to be better than doing the cleaning. So I went back to work for Dad. I remember after a couple of months, I was just not enjoying it at all. This was not the same kind of job that I was doing when I was 10 years old. The job was the same, but my heart just wasn't in it at all. I still loved working with my dad, but I did not enjoy doing the work at all. Getting up early in the morning, going out in the cold, all this kind of stuff, I just didn't enjoy it. I remember a couple of months in, my dad turned around to me and he said, you've got a choice to make, basically. He said, you've either got to find another job or get your heart behind the job that you're doing. And I kind of had to make a choice in that moment of what I wanted to do. And I went for what I considered at the time the easier choice, which was to fake enjoying the job. I decided that it was much harder to go out and find another job and have to get an interview and go through all that process. So I thought it's much easier just to turn up with a smile and say everything's fine. It turns out I'm not as good at faking it as I thought I was, because there were several times, right, 6 years I spent working with my dad after that point, and several times throughout those 6 years, I hit a point where it was just like, I am just so fed up. I have just had enough of this job. I cannot reiterate enough, it was not the people I was working with, it was the job that I was doing. I would like to point that out with him sat there. But I was doing this job and I just wasn't enjoying it. I remember a couple of times where Dad would say to me, look, you need to check yourself and kind of check your attitude, because it's showing. The customers will see it as well. They'll see that your heart's not in it. And these would be kind of like little boosting moments where I just sort of say, okay, I need to practice my smile a little bit more. And so, 7 o'clock every morning, I get in front of the mirror and go, and I wouldn't do that, but it felt like that internally. It was like I had to practice this sort of smile within in order to build up myself so that I could get through the day. I remember getting home, and every day I would just go to the bathroom as soon as I got home and spend about 45 minutes just sat in the bathroom, just sort of de-stressing after the day, because it took a toll on me to do something that I hated doing and try and show that I enjoyed it. And it took a toll on my dad as well, because he hated the fact that I was hating the job and hated the fact that he was having to see me going through that. I remember one time he really had to pull me up on it, because I got to the point where I had these sort of ups and downs. He'd address it and I'd get my smile sorted, and then I'd gradually just sort of fade. And I hit a real sort of low point. I've just had enough. And I remember the house we were sat in front of as well. It was Margaret's house that we were sat in front of. And I remember him we were sat in the van and we were about to start this job, and he said, look, we just need to talk. And when my dad says we need to talk, what that means is Dad's going to tell me something that he doesn't really want to have to say, but he knows he has to. And I'm going to sit there and say absolutely nothing, because I'm awful in those situations. So I might cry, I might say very, very little, but that's what it means when my dad says we need to talk. And so I knew this situation was kind of coming, but he sat down and he said, look, if you were anybody else, and if I was any other boss, I'd have taken you into the back and ripped shreds out of you by now, because of the attitude that you have of the job that you're doing. But I love you and I care about you, but I have to tell you that you need to change the way and the attitude in which you're doing something. My paraphrase, I can't remember the exact words you used, but it was something along those lines. And that stuck with me, because I saw the heart behind why he was doing something that he hated doing. And the fact that I was not honouring him by standing there and trying to smile and sort of say everything was fine. And I wasn't honouring myself by sitting in a job that I hated doing. And trying to fake that everything was all right. You see, my dad addressed the situation because he loved me. I responded to the situation because I loved him. There has to be a two-way thing. When it comes to honour, there's a two-way thing. Firstly, it's addressed because the person loves us. And secondly, it's addressed because we love the person. When we look at that phrase that says we develop a culture of honour through words of encouragement and correction, when we bring correction, if it's not out of love, we will get it wrong. Our heart has to be that when we address someone, when we say, you're doing something that is not honouring the culture that we have, that is not honouring the best that is in you, it has to be out of love that we address that. But then the response from that person has to be, I will do something about that because I love you. You see, if we don't have that love for one another in the church, we will come up with words of correction that are harsh, that hit our ears, and sound like a clanging cymbal that just comes across as brash and hurts. Sometimes it's very difficult to hear those words, but if it's done out of love, I knew the moment my dad said we need to talk that the heart behind it was not that he wanted to talk, he didn't want to rip shreds out of me, but he needed to address the situation. It was still quite a while after that situation before I left the job. But the difference was that probably 6 months after that, something like that, if I've got the timeline right, I think 6 months after that, I turned around to my dad and we were sat in the van again, we were driving to a job. And I kind of just got to this job and it was over in Great Bar and we were driving over there. And Great Bar from here, it took about 50 minutes to get to where we were going. It's a long drive at 7 o'clock in the morning, 50 minutes. So you're kind of tired by the time you get there. And I remember just sitting in the van and just not wanting to get out of the van. And it's sort of 8 o'clock in the morning, I just didn't want to get out and start the work. And I kind of got there and Dad sort of said, look, take a couple of days off, go take a break. And so I booked the weekend off afterwards, took a Friday and a Saturday, and I just went for a drive. Some of you know that I love to just go for a drive. That's how I kind of clear my head. If I can get 1,000 miles in a day, I'm so close to doing 1,000 miles in a day. I've done 916 and 910. I've not managed 1,000 miles yet, so one day I will get the... Yeah, I know, it's just, the last time I went, I set off earlier than I did before, and I thought, I'm going to get it this time, and I got to about 8 o'clock in the morning, and I thought, I'm absolutely shattered, so I had to pull up at the services and sleep for an hour. So I reckon I'd have got it if I hadn't slept for an hour. But he said, go away and take a drive, sort of refresh, and after I got back, we were driving back from Great Bar the one night, and I said, look, Dad, I've got to leave this job. I've got to quit. And it was that moment where I said, look, I cannot do this anymore. It is killing me. It is killing you to see me do that. And the attitude. It was like one of the things that we found when we worked together at the start was if one of us was having a bad day, the other one would be able to kind of lift the person up by taking a bit of the workload, by helping one another. Wim was talking about the fact that soldiers don't go out to war on their own. They go out together. We found that at work. That if one of us was struggling, the other one would be able to come alongside and sort of take the majority of the work that day and just sort of be the driving force behind it. It got to a point where I was never that person. So if Dad was having a bad day, we did very little work. The work ethic was horrendous in the job. And so it got to this point where I turned around and I said, look, I have to leave this job. And so I started looking for other work. I could not find anything that I wanted to do. And I remember this was sort of in the November time. And then in July, after that, Will had invited me to go over to Canada with him. And myself and Will and Barb and Jane went over to Canada for 2 weeks. And as we got back from Canada, well, actually, no, I'll tell you something that happened in Canada. Side note, but I've not really shared it with people. But my heart had kind of always been to pastor the church, but never in any serious sort of thought. It was like a bit of a daydream. I've always been a bit of a daydreamer. Kind of my head just goes off and thinks about things. It used to come home in my sport reports. Michael would do much better if he would stop daydreaming. They've probably still got those reports somewhere. So I can remember from the time that Will came back, so I was 20 years old when Will came back, I remember thinking it would be really good if one day I could pastor the church. And but it was this daydream kind of thought. And as time had gone on, it kind of became a little bit more than just a daydream. And as we went to Canada, I remember thinking that this was something I actually wanted to do. I wanted to pastor the church in Victory. I wanted to pastor this church. And George and Hazel prayed for me the last night of the first week that we were there. And they prayed, and I cannot remember the word that they brought, but I remember the word that God spoke to me on that night. And it was, are you willing to lay down the dream of pastoring Victory Church in Rugeley? And is it actually pastoring that you want to do, or is it this church that you want to pastor? And it just really shook me, because I hit this moment where it was, am I dreaming about the idea of Victory Church Rugeley, or am I dreaming about the idea of imparting into people, pastoring people and guiding people and leading them? What is my dream? Is my dream to have the church that I've grown up in and loved and just sort of be comfortable in that? Or is my dream to actually see people grow and develop? And it really sort of shook me. I remember in that moment saying, God, if you're leading me to a church other than Victory Church Rugeley, if you're calling me to start another Victory Church, or you're calling me to something else, I'll follow whatever you're leading me to. And it was that first week in Canada that I said that to God. I said, you know what, I will follow you in whatever you're leading me to. I'll do what you want me to do. And we got back after 2 weeks, and Will called me up into his office when we got back, and he said, Michael, I'd like to hand the church over to you in 5 years' time when I leave. And it was like, oh, hang on a minute, God, I've just said that I will do whatever you want me to do. I'll go somewhere else if you want me to. And now Will's coming around and saying, I want you to take on the job. And I just really felt like God was saying, I wanted to check your heart to make sure that you were doing it for the right reasons. Our heart has to be in the right place if we're going to follow the call of God, because we can be on the right path, but if our heart isn't in the right place, we will never get to the place that God is calling us to. And so Will had kind of said 5 years. If anyone knows Will, times may vary is kind of the strap line to everything that Will does. And so it went from 5 years to 4 years to about 3 and then 2.5. And so after about 2.5 years after that, it was like, okay, I'm going in September, you're taking over. It was like, okay. So it kind of got to this point, but it all came back to this moment of going through this process of doing a job with Dad where I had no idea what I wanted to do. I had no idea where I was supposed to be. But I had a choice to make in these moments where we addressed the attitude. And I've kind of gone off on a tangent a little bit, so I'm trying to bring it back to something like what I was going to talk about. But it's this idea of when we honour one another, we come to honour people through words of encouragement and through words of correction. And that moment where Dad addressed that, it was a moment of correction, but it stuck with me. It changed the way that I think about things, because I got to the point where I was thinking, if I can endure this job, I'm good in myself because I can endure something rather than thrive in something that I'm actually called to do. It was like, look at me, I can sit in a job that I hate doing and just put up with it. That's not something that we should boast in. That's not something that we should be proud of, is the fact that we can just endure the horrible things. Because I remember sitting there, and there would be days where from about 1 o'clock, I would sit there and go, I need to tell my dad I'm going to quit. I'm going to quit. I'm going to quit. I can't do this anymore. And that was the internal monologue going on in my head for hours and hours and hours every day at this job. And yet I sat there and just said, you know what? The word you use, a martyr. I'll just be a martyr for the cause. What cause? You know, quite often we sit there and you say, I'll be a martyr for Christ. I'll be a martyr for the cause. But the cause that we're on is nothing like the cause that we're supposed to be walking. What honour is there in being a martyr for a cause that is purposeless?
That's right.
We can sit there and say, I will be a martyr for Christ. I will sit in my seat week after week and just sort of say, I will suffer church. I will suffer the calling that God has placed on my life. And yet God's saying, that's not what I've called you to do. I've called you to so much more, but you're willing to sit there and suffer rather than step out and take a risk and move into the things that I'm actually calling you to do. If I'd have took a risk 6 years earlier and stepped out and said, you know what, Dad, you've put the challenge down to me that I either need to step up or find another job. I'm going to find another job because this isn't. If I'd have took that 6 years earlier, what might I have accomplished in those 6 years? I don't know whether I'd have been the pastor any sooner. I hope that I would have still been the pastor. I believe that that's where God wanted me to be. But in those 6 years, I could have done something else that would have achieved something rather than sitting there and suffering, hoping that God would just sort of magically puff something into existence. But I sat there and suffered rather than stepping out, and it was fear that kept me in that place. The fear of the unknown, the fear of moving into a new job or going to an interview. I've been to one interview in my entire life. It was awful. I didn't know what I was doing. It was for a window fitting company. I turned up. I got the appointment, the interview the day before. I applied and they gave me the interview. I turned up and they kind of told me everything. Then they said, have you got any questions? I went, nope. Worst answer you can give at an interview. Come up with some questions. And then they said, so what do you know about our company? Absolutely nothing. That's the second worst thing that you can say at an interview. So I didn't get that job, funnily enough. But the fear of going through those kind of processes, the fear of stepping out into those unknown things would keep me in a place of martyrdom, keep me in a place of being unhappy and unfit to do the job that I was doing for 6 years, rather than stepping out into something that God was calling me to do. As I say, I wanted to look a little bit at the relationship that Peter had with Jesus. And if you've got your Bibles, it's always good to look in the Bible. So turn to John chapter 1. And in John chapter 1, I'm going to look from verse 40. John chapter 1 and verse 40, it says, one of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, we have found the Messiah, which is translated the Christ, and he brought him to Jesus. Now when Jesus looked at him, he said, you are Simon, the son of Jonah. You shall be called Cephas, which is translated a stone. And I'll pause there. So the first time that Jesus encounters Peter. His brother Andrew has led him to him, and at the time his name is Simon. And as soon as Jesus encounters him, he says, you know what, you are called Simon, but I'm going to change that. I'm going to put a calling on your life. From this moment you'll be called Peter, a stone. So he puts in place a calling upon his life and says, this is the calling that you are going to live up to. This is the purpose that I am putting into your life. This is what I'm setting out at the very start, who you are going to be. You're going to be a stone, a rock in the church and in building the early church. He sets this stage up. He puts a word of encouragement, a word of praise that says, this is all that you can be. He lays on a mantle of honor for Peter. You see, when you look at the old Hebrew word for honor, it talks about a weight, but not sort of a burdensome weight, but there's a substance to it, a weight to it. There's a weight to the honor. Peter was given a substance when Jesus spoke into his life and said, I will call you Cephas, which means a stone, a rock upon which I will build this church. There was a weight, a substance. Jesus honored him in saying, there is a calling on your life, a purpose which you will begin to fulfill. And he put that weight upon it. There's an interesting thing that we read in Matthew 16, which is the time where Jesus talks to Peter and the disciples and says, who do you say I am? And they have this conversation and they come to the revelation that Jesus is the Messiah sent from God. And then Peter, it says Peter goes away and takes him to the side and wants to rebuke Jesus. And we all know the verse that comes after that really well. Jesus says, thank you. I totally forgot the verse. Get thee behind me, Satan. It's this verse that we've all heard. It's this word of correction because Peter's heart and mindset was in the wrong place. His thinking was in the wrong place. And so Jesus said, you know what? I'm going to bring you back into alignment with the honor and with the calling that I've placed on your life to start with. This is who I said you were when we first met. And you've stepped outside of that. You moved outside of what I've called you to be. I need to bring you back into place with that. You see, when we honor one another, we bring that weight of saying, this is who you're called to be. This is the purpose that you have in your life. And anytime you step outside of that, we need to bring one another back into that. And anytime we're doing and following those things, that we need to praise people and say and encourage them and say, this is the purpose that you have for your life. This is where you're supposed to be. This is the person that you're supposed to be and the calling that you're supposed to be operating in. You see, I find the interesting thing is that there's different ways and different people that we're supposed to honor. We read through the Bible and it talks about different people that we're supposed to honor. One of those is people in authority over us, that we honor those people by submitting to their authority, by coming under their rule and their reign. But there's more personal areas that I think we're supposed to honor as well. And quite often we neglect honor. We quite often see it as external. We see it as honoring other people around us, honoring those in authority over us, or honoring those who we work with and things like that, those who we have a relationship with. But actually, I think there's a couple of other areas that we have to honor as well. Firstly, we have to honor the giftings and the calling that's placed on our life. You see, when I sat in a job for 6 years and didn't do and step out into what God was calling me to do, I wasn't honoring what God had placed in my life. God hadn't placed on my life a calling to sit as a landscape gardener for 6 years, doing a job that I hated to do. And so when I sat there every day turning up to work and not enjoying it, I wasn't honoring the calling that God had placed on my life. The second thing that I think we're supposed to honor is the spirit that's within us. You see, if we don't flow in the gifts that God has placed on the inside of us, if we sit there and out of fear say, you know what, I'm not going to move in the areas that God's calling me to do. I'm not going to move when the Holy Spirit prompts me. I'm going to sit there and do nothing instead. We're not honoring the Holy Spirit that is on the inside of us. There is a challenge and a calling on the inside of us to honor the Spirit which is on the inside of us. And then thirdly, we honor God in the way that we live our lives as well. It's a much more personal thing. See, we see honor as the way that we interact with one another. But actually there's honor within ourselves as well. That we honor who we are, the gifts and the callings that are placed on our life. We honor the Holy Spirit that's within us. And we honor God as well. The interesting thing I find is that when we read this passage in John, we see that Andrew, Simon's brother, introduces Peter to Jesus. And there's only a few times in the book of John where we actually see Andrew appearing through the gospel. And you could consider him one of the less significant disciples because of this. He didn't write a book of the New Testament like some of the disciples did. You could look at the life of Andrew and say, how is he fulfilling a calling that God has placed in his life? We see very little of him. He doesn't seem to do an awful lot other than just sort of introduce Peter to Jesus. If you're calling, and the only thing that you're called to do is be a conduit for people to get to Jesus, that is one of the biggest callings that you could have on your life. Because the thing is, we see this with Andrew 3 times in the book of John. Not only here, but in John chapter 6, we see that Andrew is the person who brings the young boy with the 5 loaves and 2 fish to Jesus to feed the 5,000. And then in John chapter 12, we see that he's the one who brings the Greeks to Jesus as well, along with Philip. Andrew's calling on his life was to be a conduit for people to get to Jesus, a conduit for Jesus to meet with people. I love the passage in John chapter 6 where he feeds the 5,000, because if Andrew had said, you know what, I don't feel like I've got much of a calling on my life, I don't feel like I've got much of a purpose, I just seem to be the guest sort of host on the door that just brings people along to Jesus and sort of says, here you go, Jesus, here's the next person for you to meet, I'll go back and man the door for a bit. Have we ever felt like that in church? They've stuck me on the door. I'm just the guy that shows people into there. They've stuck me behind the coffee bar. I'm just the person who says, here's your coffee. We can get that mindset of, I'm just here. I've just been stuck there. I'm just doing this. If Andrew had that same mindset and said, you know what, I'm going on strike today. I'm not going to be a disciple today. I'm just going to sit there. Jesus has got this great big crowd in front of him. They're already sat on the grass. You know, we call it the feeding of the 5,000. It was 5,000 men, so best guess is there's probably about 12 or 15,000 people there at least. So you've got 15,000 people sat on this grass in front of Jesus. Andrew could have just sat on the hill behind him and said, you know what, the crowd's already there. I've got no one else to bring to Jesus. I'll just leave him to it. But no, he went out and found someone who had food, brought it to Jesus and said, Jesus, there's this young boy who has 5 loaves and 2 fish, but what is that amongst so many? That was the words that he used when he brought him to Jesus. The problem Andrew had in this moment was that he took the natural and perceived it as an impossible feat. You see, we read 5 loaves and 2 fish, and I always thought, how on earth does a little boy eat 5 loaves and 2 fish? Because my head instantly goes to 5 Hovis loaves of bread and 2 sort of salmons or something like that. And I think, how on earth is this boy eats more than I do. How can he sit there and eat that much food? And I sit there and think, but you know, when you actually sort of look at it in context, they were barley loaves, they were probably little round biscuits, quite thin. Barley was one of the cheapest grains that you could get in the time as well. And so it wasn't a rich man's food, it was a poor sort of meal, 5 little sort of biscuits and probably a couple of sardines or something like that, small fish. And Andrew brings this small, measly meal, fit for a little boy, to Jesus and says, here's some food, but what is it amongst so many? But Jesus knew what was possible in the hands of God rather than in the hands of man. Absolutely. You see, the weight of a problem always has to be weighed by the capacity of the person dealing with the situation. See, if we look at a situation and say, I need to fix this problem, our capacity isn't great enough to feed 15,000 people out of 5 loaves and 2 fish. But if we look at the situation and say, God is the person dealing with this, his capacity is far greater than any need that we could ever have. And so when we look at that and say, this seems an impossible task in the natural, but as soon as we put it into God's hand and say, he is the person with the capacity for that, we make it far easier, far more possible, because it's God who's dealing with it and not us. What if we looked at every situation in our life like that? Rather than saying, this seems an impossible situation, we say, God, I don't know how to deal with this, but in your hands, you'll be able to fix this problem. If every situation arose and we took that to God and said, God, I don't know how to deal with this situation right now, but I know you have the power and the capacity to see the miraculous move in this situation. We take the responsibility and the problem from our own hands, and we give it over to God and say, God, this is your situation now, and I believe that you can do it. And we see something miraculous. But we have to honor the calling that God places on our life. We have to honor the things that God has given us. I've gone a little bit off on a tangent today. It wasn't quite where I was going at all, but I hope you've kind of got something from it. We honor the things that God has placed on the inside of us through words of praise and through words of correction. But it's all about the heart. Our heart has to be in the right place. Andrew's heart was in the right place. He just wanted to bring people to Jesus. My dad's heart was in the right place when he corrected me because he just wanted the very best for me.
Yeah.
My heart had to be in the right place to respond to that because I loved him and wanted to honour the things that he'd done for me.
That's great.
Our heart has to be in the right place before we will ever see a culture of honour working properly within the church. I'm going to leave it there because it's 1:45. I hope you've got something from it. We're going to take a break. There's going to be tea and coffee again. We're back at 12 o'clock. We're handing back over to Win. Win basically has the next hour. He can do what he likes. If you want some ministry time, you can put some of that in there as well. Lunch will be at 1 o'clock. So we're going to break till 12 now. Grab tea and coffee, pop to the loo, and then at 12 o'clock we will start at 12 o'clock sharp this time because I started late last time. But at 12 o'clock we'll start and then we'll break at 1 for lunch. So thank you guys, and we'll see you soon.
That's great.
Thank you.
Nice one. The scripture, I think, never gets preached on